This episode is sponsored by patrons like Kevin Butler and Brilliant. It's a skills development website that uses interactive challenges to teach. For example, every research question needs to start with a search, and becoming competent in using online search engines is imperative to that skill. Well, Brilliant has a course specifically for that. Each challenge builds on one another to the point that you will eventually understand the back end of how these systems function. Having just taught a class that spent an entire week on how to do exactly that, I can confirm getting the fundamentals down is absolutely necessary. It allows you to discover what is already done on a given subject, especially the miscellaneous items that may not show up when you simply search. So learning how a thesaurus helps or when to use special parameters can vastly increase your ability to explore a topic. That's where Brilliant can help. They have a bunch of courses meant to develop your problem-solving skills in such topics as math, science, and coding. You'll solve challenges and advance your competence through this interactive format. They tell a story to keep you engaged and powering through the difficult spots. The first 200 to go to the link below, which is brilliant.org/thecynicalhistorian, will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. And there's many more courses to explore. Anyways, on with the show. Hey, Cypher here. When we talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction, we're typically focused on the South. After all, the South seceded and then needed to be reconstructed to fulfill all the new civil rights that came with the war. Hence the small amounts of troops needed to remain in the South as a constabulary after putting down their insurrection. That's all very important history, but we kinda miss the larger picture of what's happening here. One that renders the civil rights motive of Reconstruction extraneous to the even larger motive, reconstructing race. But in order to do that, we have to decenter the South, and see just how much of a role the West played in this greater Reconstruction. Historian Elliot West first proposed this greater Reconstruction idea in his presidential speech at the Western Historical Association. He said, "This greater Reconstruction was even more morally ambiguous than the lesser one. It included not one war, but three: the Mexican War, Civil War, and War against Indian America. And while it saw the emancipation of non-white people, it was equally concerned with dominating others." There has always been a darker side to E pluribus unum, and when we look at the parallel policies toward Indians and blacks, we can see it in its full breathtaking arrogance. Western expansion was the basis of the argument over slavery, which caused the Civil War in the first place. The sectional crisis debated whether slavery should expand into the West. Bleeding Kansas was simply the most significant outcropping of that conflict, but the violence of that event was minuscule by comparison to what was happening in California simultaneously. Miners during the gold rush targeted the indigenous population, attempting to exterminate them. In the case of at least one tribe, they were successful. California is the only state with a genocide named after it, and the violence began in 1849, but did not end until after the Civil War 2 decades later. All of these things I've already done episodes on. They recontextualize the causes of the Civil War to not only being about slavery, but how the US would define ourselves. From a loose union of states and territories to a nation struggling to characterize freedom. Who was incorporated into that nation-state and how was the question of greater Reconstruction. Historian of American violence Richard Maxwell Brown envisioned the frontier portion of answering that question as a Western Civil War of incorporation. He said the war was fought in many places and on many fronts in almost all the Western territories and states. Much like Frederick Jackson Turner a century prior had theorized that waves of civilization sweeping across the frontier defined what makes America unique, Brown argued that incorporation flowed westward in waves. First, over what races were included or excluded, then who controlled Western land, and finally who held authority over labor. Greater Reconstruction is essentially the first wave, defining which races were equal, considered lesser, or excluded altogether. For American Indians, they became the latter of those categories during the Civil War and Lesser Reconstruction. They were so excluded by the end that Vindaloria said, "The deep impression made upon American minds by the Indian struggle against the white man in the last century has made the contemporary Indian somewhat invisible compared with his ancestors." So let's go through how exactly Indians became excluded from America's national identity through Greater Reconstruction, a wrong that we still struggle to correct today. As constabulary troops withdrew to fight the insurrection in the South, the West lost the only thing stabilizing it. Dakota Sioux in Minnesota weren't getting their treaty-mandated provisions, but what really set them off was a hunting party that killed 5 settlers, who were in legally occupied land. Knowing the inevitable retributive expedition was coming, and not having received enough rations required by treaty due to the Civil War. So, the tribe decided to strike first by massacring German immigrants in the region, killing between 400 and 800 of them. The U.S. Army responded quickly, quelling the uprising and rounding up the entire tribe. They interned the population on a frozen island for a year before deporting them to a small reservation in South Dakota. More than 300 were sentenced to be hanged for insurrection, but President Lincoln pardoned all but 32, leading to a mass hanging. This set the tone for how the U.S. would deal with Western Indians. Though it began with one of the worst massacres in U.S. history, the federal government would funnel the outrage towards any tribe possibly breaking out of a new system. Indian Territory was now to be treated as federal reservations for the concentration of peaceful tribes away from Americans. California provided the initial blueprint with various rancherias, and those tribes not on reservations were either exterminated or eventually concentrated. Any form of tribal raiding or violence against settlers provided the excuse for this policy of concentration onto reservations. 3 tribes exemplified this trend during the Civil War: Shoshones, Navajos, and Cheyennes. All 3 had raided settlers for over a decade, especially since settler control of territory kept needed food from native hands. Shoshones had fought Mormons since their arrival in the 1840s. After some spectacular raids during the Civil War, Californian volunteers went after the tribe, cornering a large number of them at Bear River in modern-day Idaho. The ensuing massacre killed around 250, and the remaining tribe had to either integrate with Mormons or be concentrated onto reservations. Cheyennes started attacking miners in 1959 because of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. A warrior society called Dog Soldiers perpetrated the most heinous raids. So when Colorado volunteers returned from New Mexico in 1864, they attacked what they thought were dog soldiers, but was actually an obviously peaceful band under the protection of a local fort near Sand Creek. Coloradans massacred more than 150 and even celebrated it in their press. Easterners did not agree, including the U.S. Army, who denigrated the expedition, saying they surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe they were under the protection of the United States authority, and then returned to Denver and boasted of their brave deed. This led the Cheyenne on a tidal wave of retaliatory strikes throughout the territory. Only after a year of warfare were Cheyennes in Colorado either concentrated or sent seeking refuge with other tribes, especially their recent allies, Lakota Sioux, which would have repercussions for decades. In the case of Navajos, they'd been killing New Mexicans for over a century. After the Union sent Confederate invaders packing in 1862, the soldiers of the California Column imposed martial law on New Mexico and helped separate Arizona into what it is today. To maintain order, they sought to squash the Navajo raiders that plagued the territory since Spanish times. After all, the tribe had broken the Treaty of 1851 that said they would never engage in such behavior, thereby taking a steady toll in New Mexican lives throughout the 1850s and 60s. Of no consequence to Army officers' consideration was the fact that New Mexicans had marauded Navajos in return for centuries. So James Carleton, commander of the Californians and military governor of New Mexico, ordered the famous scout Kit Carson to implement the concentration policy on Navajos. He'd already rounded up Mescalero Apaches in southern New Mexico onto a reservation called Bosque Redondo, and Carleton figured that was a good place to send the completely different Navajo tribe. On such orders, Carson implemented a scorched earth campaign on Navajos until they were all herded together in 1864, which is perhaps the first implementation of total war during the Civil War. Carson then forced marched the entire tribe in 53 groups across 400 miles of arid territory to Bosque Redondo. This trek alone killed over 200 of them, but the horde conditions at the reservation killed many more. In 1868, the U.S. signed a treaty with Navajos, creating a reservation in their homeland. That would be one of the last few treaties signed between the United States with what the Supreme Court called her domestic dependent nations. This meant that legal doctrine generally treated tribes as subordinate to American sovereignty. The U.S. used treaties to negotiate with tribes, but Congress ended that in 1871, effectively abrogating the entire process and creating the reservation system instead. This was part of a completely new policy that the Grant administration instituted, which they called the peace policy. Just like he took a more reformist attitude to Reconstruction in the South, this policy was meant to reform Indian relations. The main job of the peace policy was to keep Indians on reservations and begin assimilating them into American society. Grant appointed legions of evangelical missionaries to oversee these reservations, attempting to convert entire tribes to Christianity as the first step towards assimilation. For those who refused and left, they were considered hostiles to be brought back by force if necessary. This is where we get the term going off the reservation. You see, this peace policy ultimately separated tribes into specific enclaves, thereby preventing them from raiding settlements. The Indian wars throughout the Grant administration were mostly to keep tribe members on the reservation. For instance, there was the Yavapai War, which began with the Camp Grant massacre in 1871. Some Arizonan ranchers and Tohono-O'odhams murdered nearly 150 Apaches, mostly women and children, in a morning sneak attack. The first photograph of Tucson is of their trial, and justifying the massacre is the original basis of the Arizona Historical Society. Obviously angered by this, Apaches fled the reservation and began raiding. It took 4 years to bring them all back, including a siege that led to another massacre at what's now called Skeleton Cave. A year after Camp Grant, 150 Modocs escaped the Klamath Reservation and managed to resist for nearly an entire year. There's a lot of other examples throughout this entire period, not just Grant's failed peace policy, but the entirety of Greater Reconstruction, as in from 1848 to 1877. So here's a list scrolling by of all the Indian wars during that time frame. There's a lot, so I just can't cover them all. One of these revealed the ultimate failure of the peace policy. An army expedition under the command of George Armstrong Custer meandered through Lakota lands in 1874. It was meant to map the area and find good fort locations for the reservation, but they also found gold in the Black Hills. Custer leaked it to the press against Grant's explicit orders. So, of course, miners rushed into the hills, which Lakotas consider holy. A year later, Lakotas traveled to Washington to beg Grant to stem the tide. His administration was beset by corruption scandals and he did nothing. So Lakotas did what they were good at, and started raiding the miners, even as they formed a town called Deadwood. Grant responded by sending delegates to the Great Sioux Reservation and bolstered the neighboring forts. Due to a previous treaty, Lakotas had the right to hunt outside their reservation, but the federal government ordered them back. The bands that didn't recognize the treaty kept hunting, and so the army was tasked with rounding them up. Soldiers pushed across the plains, engaging in a number of fights to bring the non-treaty bands back on the reservation. One of the units in this pincer movement was led by Custer again, but this time, luck was not in his favor. At the Little Bighorn River, his force was surrounded, massacred, and mutilated. It was one of the worst defeats the army had experienced since St. Clair's defeat in 1791. The army eventually swept up the Lakotas, who did an escape to Canada, but this was extremely embarrassing for Grant's peace policy, made all the worse because it happened just a week prior to the United States celebrating our centennial. It was also an election year. His peace policy had failed, but assimilation would continue well past Reconstruction, only ending with the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act and 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act. Plus, we still have lingering issues with tribal sovereignty today. Throughout Greater Reconstruction, races navigated inclusion or exclusion in the American nation. For black people in the South, the failure of Reconstruction meant a resurgence in disenfranchisement and segregation, called Jim Crow. For Indians in the West, that failure meant their concentration on reservations and white domination by assimilation. Both were excluded from American nationalism. Reconstructing race ultimately allowed for white supremacy to become an underwriting principle of the nation that emerged from our Civil War. We may have ended slavery, but Reconstruction could not fully institute civil rights. That would be left to another generation, for both black and indigenous people alike.